Hello, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 7 of Dreamforce. Thank you for being here. So actually give yourselves a round of applause for being upright and ready to talk about stuff on day 4. Thank you, thank you. So I hope you were here for Code Everyone Loves, because that's what we're going to talk about, right?
Is that what we're talking about?
Oh,
yes.
I think so.
Okay,
yeah.
Let's do it.
Laura, do you want to give away the surprise of who you are?
Yes, hello. I am Laura Meerkatz. I'm a developer for Salesforce.org.
And a badass, if I do say so myself. My name is Zane Turner. I'm a developer evangelist for Salesforce.com.
Needs no introduction. Rocked it at the keynote. I hope you all saw. She was amazing.
And now your favorite slide of the conference, that I skipped because it's so amazing, of our forward-looking statement, just reminding you, any purchasing decisions based on current technology, not forward-looking statements. And luckily today, we are talking about things you can do right now in your org with your code. So we made a little bit of a promise, I think, when we titled the session, and I'm guessing that some of you were interested in that promise, of the idea that what are we talking about when we say it's code everyone loves, like for real. And as developers, we're responsible for the happiness and well-being of pretty much every stakeholder in our app. And the idea of everyone is all of the people that are going to be interacting with our app in some way or another, because everyone cares about getting their job done. So the end users of our apps, whether they're customers or people internal to your business, they care about literally doing their jobs or getting the service that they need provided to them. So they want it to be easy to use, intuitive, fast, all those things we hear all the time, right? And the other members of your team that are maybe just building with different tools, whether they identify as admins or they're also developers, they want your app to be flexible. They want to make changes without having to push code and go through a release cycle over and over and over again for minor changes. And other developers, or even your future self, they want your code to be readable, right? Refactorable, approachable, all of these things. When we talk about code everyone loves, it's on all of these different dimensions. But I myself will admit, sometimes my apps have been a little less than perfect, just only once or twice.
Never again.
Never again. And it was maybe just my first app, but it's hard. That's not an easy thing to deliver. We're under a lot of pressure. When was the last time any of you could just miss a check-in or a release? Raise your hand. Never had a deadline. No one? Yeah, one person has the perfect job. Please talk to this gentleman. 2 people after the session, get their information.
They're probably self-employed.
But we don't have a lot of time. We have to meet the demands of our business, of our users, all of these things, which means then we like to use what we know, maybe, because we know that we can get it done. We know how to build that way. We know how to build correctly that way. We know what performance will be like. So we tend to use the same habits and tools. And then also because we don't have time and because we're solving problems, often we're solving, I don't know, maybe 8 story points worth of problems in a 2-week increment, because isn't that the way that, and then that doesn't lead to always seeing the biggest picture, right? It's the what's in the backlog. What are the 5 things we have to do? What's the bug that we're doing now? So we're going to address that. We can't give you more time. What we can do is talk about the skills that we can build to get better in the limited time we have. And we're here for a reason, right? Laura, do you want to take us through where did the session come from?
Right on, yeah. So I have the best job in the world. #dreamjob. I work for Salesforce.org, and actually the thing that I work on just got a write-up under the heading, the app that Salesforce employees use to change the world. So not bad, I'll take it. The app is called Volunteerforce, and it helps our users find volunteering opportunities and organizations to donate to and get matching donations for.
I'm a user of her app.
It is. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. So one of the coolest things from a technical standpoint about this app is that we have gone through a few different iterations of this. It's been around for a while, so we've been able to build and rebuild and learn from some of our just decisions that we made earlier on. So we just launched the most recent version of Volunteerforce in August. This is built on a Lightning community. We're super excited about it. And as we were building this, we got to really think about how are we going to make sure that we are building as much flexibility into this app as possible, so that when we're trying to make changes, learn from some of the things that we've done, we can do that easily. And so today, I'm telling you about this just because I wanted to use this as an example of an app that we're going to build a simplified version of one of these features of together, so that you kind of have a story to frame some of the patterns that we're going to talk about. So we're going to look at that recommendations feature. And before anyone asks, it's not Einstein recommendations. We're working on that project in parallel, but these are Apex-based recommendations. So we're going to talk about some Apex-based ideas that you can use.
Awesome. So as we said, we can't give you more time, but these are the 4 patterns we're going to talk about. And you're going to see this over and over, and we're going to have this slide again at the end, but if you want to take a picture, go for it. These are the themes we're going to address, talking about categorization and how we control our variables, how we design our classes, and then also actually how we even approach problems, going from sort of really granular to a bigger picture. So Laura, and because I know that everyone will be concerned, we have a repo for this and we have a trail mix for this, and we will share the information about how you get the code and how you go explore these concepts in other places as well. So all of this is yours.
That's right. We're going to share little snippets of this code, and if you want to see everything else, if you want to revisit this, it is all available for you in our repo.
All right, Laura, so take us through. How do we categorize in one place? What in the heck does that even mean?
Right, so before I dive into that, I'm going to show you our sample app that we've built out. We've taken this notion of, we have to switch to...
Maybe we can't do it this way.
One moment, please.
Right, as we play nice with the projection. And seriously, well, we'll at least get in.
I'll reopen it once we get there.
Right, we wanted to not do the escape trick, but now we're gonna have to.
Don't close it, don't close it.
No, we're not gonna close it. We're gonna maximize. This is what we're gonna have to do. We'll just play nice like that and then shrink it because it's not on the screen now.
Shrink, come on over, buddy. It helps when you can see the whole screen, makes the story much more effective. Okay, so we've taken this concept of recommendations for an event that you might be interested in, and we've applied it to the conference management app that's available on Trailhead. So it's the Build a Conference app. We have this linked in our trail mix, and it's got the data model that we're using that you can then build on top of to build these recommendations. So I'm on a contact page right now, and this is someone who's going to be attending our conference, and on the right side you can see some recommendations that we're making for sessions that Jay might be interested in. And if I scroll down a little bit, you'll see some similar looking fields on the contact itself. So you can see some topics, some roles, some levels, some things that Jay is interested in that we're then using to match against some of the topics, levels, roles that are part of our session.
Okay, so I get this. So based on what Jay has said on his contact or the things he likes or is interested in, we're recommending sessions. But that's not just a SOCL query, right? I mean, are we pulling, we see code everyone loves, which is amazing, but when the session's over, is that going to stay there?
No, so these are dynamic recommendations that are being calculated on the fly, and we're doing this through a 2-step process. So we're going to start by doing a query for a bunch of sessions that we know are eligible for recommendations, because not every session is something that we want to recommend.
So we're crossing into the area of complex business logic, if you didn't already follow the setup. So what we decide is even eligible for recommendations. It's things that maybe are, if this conference was something called, I don't know, Dreamforce, we would want to show those,
such a name.
Right? Or if it was then Trailhead DX, we wouldn't want to show Dreamforce sessions.
Yeah, and if something is already passed, I don't want to get a recommendation today for a session that happened on Monday. That's already happened.
Okay, so what does that look like in the code?
Right, so let's take a look at the code, and we will resume. Look at a few different versions of how we could write this query. I'll zoom out just a little bit. This is the first version of how we could do this. We could take all of the logic for sessions that we want to include, and we could build that right into our where clause. So you can ignore most of the first half of this, but our where clause right here, you can see that we're starting to filter out. If it's full, we don't want to show it. If it's got something like private in the name, we don't want to show it. But this is starting to look messy already, and I can promise you this is a contrived example. The real version of this query, and there was one, was much longer, much messier. And when someone would come to us later and say, actually, we want to exclude things with executive track in the name too, it was hard to even wade through what was there, let alone make changes and then have to go through that whole deployment cycle.
Right, and right there on line 30 now, we're hard coding in some values, essentially, right? Anytime we want to change what could be a pick list, we're having to push code.
Right.
And I'm seeing that not in, that's an expensive query. How did this perform?
Well, not great. Not great.
Okay, so how do we fix it?
Well, so we're going to fix one of the problems, making this easier to change by moving all of that logic into a formula field.
What?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really simple concept, right? But this is something that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Like, oh, if I find myself writing a really complex SQL query, is what I'm doing actually describing a complex property of the record that I'm pulling? So in this case, whether or not something should be included in recommendations, it's really just a property of a session, but it's built on a bunch of different values that are on that session.
So we're abstracting the business logic into a formula field.
That's right.
So that then if we want to change and say, oh, and we shouldn't have executive track in there, or we want to change the date of when it's eligible, or only this many seats left, I could go in there and do that without pushing code.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's a fairly simple concept, but something that really helps improve our flexibility in our code.
But I know that formula fields are only realized at runtime. So when we start pushing thousands of records through this, how does this perform?
Yeah, the performance on this is not great either. So we're actually going to take this one step further. And in addition to our formula field, we're going to have a non-formula field that we are copying on a scheduled basis. So this is just a Boolean field. We have a scheduled batch job that goes through and runs periodically. So let's take all the information from that formula field, copy it into this other field. And this is going to get faster. And if you were working with a large data set and you want to make it even faster yet, you can contact support and talk to them about getting a custom index on a field, which is something anyone can request.
Okay, so we've gone from a multi-line, very, very long SQL query to, okay, we're going to abstract and categorize that business logic in a formula field. And then we're going to build on top of that formula field on a batch basis, storing this actually in that include and recommendations stored that we see on line 68, Boolean. So that then that's what's in our code right now, is just that Boolean field, right?
Exactly. So this is the version that we end up with. It's much easier to read in code, and when we want to make changes, we're not coming back to code to do it.
Cool. Anything else you want to show us?
I think that's it on this one. Let's go back to the slides.
Thank you. Oh, as we saw, the preview of categorizing in one place. So think about using those formula fields. It's not just for reporting. It can be for complex business logic. Putting those calculated values, as Laura said, on records, because you have the information you need to decide if this is available for recommendations, but your business logic is probably going to change. It's easier to make a change there. But then keep an eye on your performance, because formula fields are expensive. Time-based calculations, as we know, are expensive. So then think about some of those batch jobs. And then the last point that we didn't talk about as much, but is incredibly important, you saw the code comments Laura had, which are also in the repo, but on the field, in that include and recommendations stored, that sounds a lot like include and recommendations. And if I'm coming in to look at this instance and I've never seen it before, I'm going to start thinking, okay, did we just not see that we built that field? Did another group want the same field built for them and nobody said, hey, stop? Describe what that field's doing, that it's being used in a batch job. This is why it's a Boolean. All of those sort of things that make it easier to work with this pattern you've created.
Always be kind to your future self.
Okay, Laura, speaking of being kind, thank you for taking over working the keyboard. We're sharing that beautifully. I don't always like to
Obama
share.
talk, she talked about how important it is to share.
Well, so what do we mean about sharing control of variables?
Yeah, we mean that as developers, we like to keep control over everything, but maybe if we thought about what our admins wanted to do, or again, what our future selves might want to do more easily, that we could share some of that control.
Okay, so show us. What does this look like?
Right, so back in our app, we talked about the first step of getting those recommendations being that we're going to go through getting all of the recommendation sessions that could be eligible, but then we actually do want to run through an algorithm that will say which sessions should score more highly for Jay, which ones are more relevant to his interests. So we're going to take that pool and we're going to reorder it so that we get the most important stuff up top.
Right, so we've decided suddenly now that role is the most important thing rather than topic.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we could do this by writing a really complex if-then statement. I'm not going to show you this because I didn't even like typing it out for a demo, but you can imagine how this would work. Like, if the topics match, add 10. If the roles match, add 20. And you could end up with this if-then statement that goes on for days. And then when you decide you want to change the weight on one of those things, change that 20 to a 25, you got to go back in your code and change everything.
Okay, so how do we fix that?
So let's not do that. So we're going to use custom settings to actually control each of the different factors. And that will even make it easier for our code to kind of handle each one of these factors in a common way. And so when we want to make a change, we can go in here and say, actually, we know that level is way more important to users than role in terms of their interest. So we're going to bump this up. And here, I'll show you before I click save. You can see code everyone loves, reports, Commodore 64. In that order, I'm going to hit save, hope that I remembered the correct one of these values to change to make the demo work correctly, and then hit refresh. And now we're seeing that Commodore 64 session bumped up in the second spot because we have adjusted how our factors balance out.
And even the baseline for our recommended score changed. We even changed like what's the possible highest score right here without touching our code.
Right. So this is another super simple concept. I'm sure many of you have used custom settings before. You can do this with custom metadata types as well. But it's more about getting that pattern in your head of, okay, if this is something that especially if it's something we know we're going to want to change. When we're building recommendations, we don't have perfect information about what's important to users. We want to be able to learn and grow. So if you're in that situation, think about using a custom setting. Think about using custom metadata type.
So again, we're seeing this pattern, though, of also it's business logic. And even though we can write an algorithm to match it based on we think this is what recommendations should look like today, that's business logic that can change. So we're sharing control of the back-end variables in a custom setting, giving away that algorithm to be more scalable. Can we give away something about how, like something in the UI, how it performs on the screen here?
We absolutely can. So if you've been paying close attention to this contact record, you may have noticed that we're tracking some location information on here, but we don't have anything that mentions distance on our recommendations. But we know we're trying to build that in. So let's take a look at the page builder, which is going to be tiny, tiny, tiny. Maybe zoom out a little bit.
Yeah, that's good.
And if I click on our recommendations panel, I can see we've added one little design attribute that then gives us some control over what we're doing within this component and how we're displaying this. And you probably can't see it, but we are actually showing a place for distance here. We aren't calculating it yet. We'll get to that part in just a minute. But these design attributes in your Lightning components are super easy to set up. I hope you've all seen them before, but if you're not thinking about this, this is a way that you can leave some of those choices up to the admin who's configuring the page.
And we actually have resources in the trail mix to show you how to do this. One example is we could build this component, and depending on, say you're running a query for sessions based on level, sessions based on role, sessions based on theme, show the same component 3 ways on one page, you can do that with a design attribute. You can give control of how are we running that query, and there's a pattern in Trailhead that will show you how to do that. Okay.
All right, so back to the slides.
Time for some takeaways.
Woo.
Okay, so don't code what you know will change. We have custom settings or metadata that we can use to give control of those back-end variables, that business logic that could be an algorithm. Instead, we can make it these settings that we can change on the fly. And we can explore using design attributes to change the behavior at runtime. How are we comparing this? What attributes are we going to emphasize? All right, our third theme. When we were writing this presentation, I was very much into let's make memorable snippets for people for these themes. We got to this one, and I have to admit, I turned to Laura and I said, Laura, this sounds great, but if people knew how to do this, they wouldn't be in this session. What does this even mean?
Right, so if I'm talking to any of you coming from a Java background or an object-oriented programming background, I'm not going to say anything that is new and exciting here, but I know I've met a lot of Apex developers who weren't coming from that background, who didn't have that experience.
I am not from that background.
Yes, so object-oriented programming really talking about abstraction in code in a way that allows you to move pieces of your code in and out, swap things out, and provides you just a ton of flexibility in what you're even running behind the scenes.
Okay, so what does it look like?
All right, so in our app, we just talked about wanting to include some information about geolocation. So we are going to move into how we set up a geocoding service. So we already have geocoding set up on contacts here. You can see we're getting a latitude and longitude back for an address, and we're currently doing this. Oops, do not click on that. We're currently doing this with a geocoding button. You could obviously do this in a trigger or flow as well.
But right there in the quick actions, we have that geocode button. That's running a service, and we're getting that on the record.
Yeah, so what we're talking about with abstraction here is really how we set up that service. It would have been really easy when you're sitting on this problem, go like, okay, so what I'm trying to do is geocode contacts, so I'm going to do it with the demo API, and so I'm just going to create a class that calls the demo API, and then it updates a contact record, right? Like, I could do that. Or I could think about, what's the higher level problem I'm trying to solve? Is it possible that I'll ever want to use a different service? Is it possible that I'll ever want to geocode anything other than a contact?
Right, like an example from my background was payment processing. I was setting up a payment processor, and we had a current vendor that we were using, but we were actively thinking about adding on 2 or 3 more, or even stopping the contract with that vendor based on the rate. So then when I was building that code, I had to ask myself, okay, well, what do we need out of a payment processor? And it's you need to know who the person is. You need to know what they're paying with, right? You need to know how much they owe you. You need to go call whatever service, confirm what happened. That larger pattern of every time we process a payment, there's a system. Every time we're geocoding, we need, I don't know, latitude and longitude.
So we're going to take a look at the code for that. To define just that kind of contract of what does it mean to be a geocoder? What can a geocoder do? We're going to create an interface. And an interface is a lot like a class, except that you notice there's no logic inside any of those methods. There's just a signature and a placeholder for what that would mean if you wanted to then go ahead and implement these things. And by doing this, it means that we can set up code that can have a central point for being the thing that handles geocoders, and then we can have a custom setting that says, okay, which flavor of that do I want to use right now? So if I look at what that means for the code, you can see I'm calling, this is the backend logic for our little button. It's just a Visualforce redirect page, super simple. But on line 15 here, I'm calling this generic geocoder, and it's calling that geocode records method. And it's going to work with any geocoding service that I give it that I have implemented. And I'll take a look at the custom setting for that. Hold on, let's refresh this. So a couple things you'll notice here. This is where I would define some of the properties for my service.
So like right there, I can see the endpoint, so we can decide which service we're calling. We could call a different service if we don't want to use. I know we all love the demo API. It's one of our favorites. But if we wanted to say call Google or some other geolocating service, we could put that there.
Yes, but one really nice use case for this is, what if I want to demo all of my settings for my API, and I don't actually want to give my API key away to a room full of people? So instead, we're going to call this demo class. The demo class, all it does is it returns the same Latin long every single time, no matter what you give it. Super simple. But if you look really closely, you can also see down below that I've got a separate setting for here.com geocoder. So by using a hierarchy custom setting, not only can I define which one of these classes am I calling whenever I say geocode something, what does that mean? I can even set up different answers to that question based on the profile of who's running it. So if I want to try out a new service, if I'm working on the OpenCage API and I want to see how that works and I just want to try it out with my system administrators, I can define that at the profile level. I can keep everybody else using the old service that we know is stable, and they can have both running in parallel, calling from the same code.
That's awesome.
So just to take a look at some of that code. This is our demo geocoder. I told you it's not super smart, but what you're going to see is these methods that we define in our interface actually implemented in this class. And if I scroll down, this is our super simple geocode addresses that is just always returning the same result.
Most reliable service ever.
This one never goes down.
It's in the repo for all of you to take home.
Never slow. Always works beautifully.
But so then as you build, so we could build 5 more of these classes that then implement what it means to be a geocoder differently.
Right, exactly. And if you're a package developer, if you are working with organizations that might want to take what you've done and do something slightly different with it, this is super powerful. This means that if you want to ship your product with an out-of-the-box payment processor, you can go ahead and have your implementation for that payment processor. But you can also leave the door open for your customers to say, we want to use something different, but we want it to solve the same problem.
Awesome. Are we ready for some takeaways?
We're ready for some takeaways.
So we're talking about that idea of what does it mean to be a geocoder? What does it mean to be a payment processor? Getting in this idea of watching for patterns. And then when you think pattern, it doesn't necessarily then mean get good methods, get clean method names. It means maybe you should be making an interface. Maybe you should define the pattern that you know your code needs to follow over and over and over again in an interface, because that's exactly what it does. And then the last part about not confusing efficiency with dependencies was something that I did a lot as I was having to churn out a ton of code all at the same time. And then as I was learning how do I want to design this system and how do I want to organize it. And I thought one way that was awesome to organize is I've already written this awesome algorithm that's sorting how I respond to payments. I'll just aim every class back at that one class. And then when we decide we're not using a certain vendor anymore, I've now blown all 50 other classes that are aiming at this one class. So efficiency and just knotting your code together isn't as flexible as defining that pattern in the interface, where then I can swap out a new clean service and not wreck everything I've built before.
Right. So if this is something that is brand new to you, like I said, Java, this is so old news that I'm sure that there's somebody out there who's like, this is like 15 years old, why are you telling me this now? But go find an introductory Java course and it'll do a great job of explaining how this all fits together.
And again, in our trail mix, you'll also have resources that explain this kind of pattern on the platform and what does that mean in Apex and what you should look out for. All right, so our last theme, don't solve the same problem twice. Laura, you said that the whole reason that we wanted to talk about the session was when you were building Volunteerforce, you were solving the same problem over and over and over again. What does that really look like? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I mean, I just kind of hinted at this a minute ago. I said, well, what if we wanted to do geocoding with a different service? Or what if I wanted to do geocoding for some other part of my system? What if this is a problem that I know that I'm going to see again? How can I make sure that I write code that's reusable in another instance? So in this case, I'm going to show you guys a little magic trick. We are going to go ahead and set up geocoding on a brand new object.
So that geocoding button we saw in the contact, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, we're going to go ahead and set that up for session. And just to be totally transparent, I have gone ahead and set up some address fields and a location field just to hold this data, but there's currently not any service that is hooked up to this object to go ahead and geocode it. So to get that set up, I am going to create a new field map. And what this custom setting is doing is telling Salesforce what it means to be an address for this object. So if I was on contact, I would be putting mailing city in this field, but in this case, the set of fields that I'm looking for.
We maybe have done this before.
Yeah, this is actually easier this time because I didn't have it set up the first time around, had to type all this by hand. Now I'm spoiled.
So this custom setting is holding the logic of, well, what do we mean on this object when we say postal code? Because we know that on the account, that compound field has a certain API name. But because we're on a custom object, it's going to have a different API name. So we're holding that logic there in that what you just did.
Yep, and now I'm just going to go into my contact button, and I'm just going to steal it because you know I don't like typing things twice. I'm just going to go ahead and grab this. We're going to go back into session, create a new button, detail button in the same space. And the only change I'm going to make here is that instead of passing in that contact ID, I'm going to pass in a session ID. I'll save this, and of course we'll get the warning, which is lovely for the middle of a demo when you're likely to forget things, that we do have to go ahead and add this to a page layout. So we'll go ahead and get in our page layouts, add this button. And now we have a geocode button on session. Should we go see if it works?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's refresh. Get our button.
What?
All right, I'm going to applaud
Right,
myself.
okay, come on.
None of y'all are impressed.
Thank you. I know your hands hurt.
Thank
It's
you.
day 4, but that was magic.
A little bit, right? So how are we able to do that? Well, when we set up the code for this, we didn't hardwire the mapping between like when we get that address information back, or when we send the address information in, here are the fields it's coming from. When we get it back, here are the fields it's going to. Instead, we use dynamic apex.
Who here has used dynamic apex? It's written. Okay, so good. We got some familiarity.
All right, everybody else look around, check those hands, see who you're going to talk to after the session.
Right.
Dynamic apex gives us a way to just reference field names as strings, which means that we can pass dynamic values into those strings and process them accordingly.
And I like to think about it, dynamic apex is apex that doesn't care what S object it's working with. It's going to just take in what you're doing and work with it anyway. And so when we start talking about don't solve the same problem twice, one way we apply that is don't limit yourself to one object. Start to become object agnostic, because we know needs change all the time. And if you've done all the beautiful work of making an interface to say, oh, I know how to then accept payments with any kind of service, what if we suddenly have launched a new line of business, another set of custom objects, or another place in our business needs to use payments? If you've written it with dynamic apex, you could do what Laura just did and use different objects, same code base.
Exactly. So we're looking at the code that is pulling the information out of each part of the address so that we can send it to our service. And if we had written this in a non-dynamic version, it would look something like contact.mailing street. But instead, you can see in the comments here, what this dynamic apex is actually doing. It's saying, go to this record, get me the field called mailing street, and then process it as though it is a string, because you're always going to get an object back from that because it's totally flexible. It could return anything.
And we did a custom setting here to show you that field map. This is actually another great place to explore custom metadata. And there's, again, to point you back to the trail mix that shows you how to write object-agnostic Lightning components that goes through this pattern and uses custom metadata, because there's a new feature that lets you use, when we did that map of we were aiming back at a field and Laura had to type the API name of the fields all correctly, hopefully, it helps your users not have to worry about that, because you can do a lookup. You can say, okay, what object am I looking at? And then any of those field mappings you want to do, it presents in a pick list form. So then if someone goes through and changes the API name or the field label of that field, your custom metadata with that mapping stays intact.
All right, so back to the slides for one more recap.
So again, we mean it, yeah. Watch for patterns. And think about this idea of what did I just do, and can I make it even more reusable by being object agnostic? And a good way to start thinking about that, again, is dynamic apex is more reusable, right? And our final summary, as we've covered, as we saw, we went from micro, categorizing one place, thinking about the simplest use case of business logic, a query. Hey, maybe we can actually put that in a formula field. Oh, and then when we get a little bigger and we think about, oh, our algorithms, our variables, do I have to keep putting that in my code if it's going to change? Maybe I can abstract that out into something in the front end, into a custom setting. And then even moving into even more abstraction of if you're noticing patterns in your code, could you put that in an interface or an abstract class? And then finally, as we just saw, why are we even caring about what object we're working on? Maybe we want to change what object that is tomorrow.
And all of that was just 4 different ways for us to change how our code is running without touching any of our code. We just did we changed what sessions we're looking at, how different things are weighted, what services we're calling, what objects we're even operating on, and we didn't touch a line of code.
So if you want to see this entire code base, right there, that bit.ly link of the code-everyone loves will take you to the GitHub repo. And then the trail mix that we may keep adding to, who knows, the mix everyone loves, check it out. It has some of these patterns in Apex. It has that object reusability, and it has the trail that has the data model, the event management project app. If you want to start reproducing this data model and pull the code down and use it yourself in a demo org, feel free.
And with that, we have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody wants to come up to the mic,
To the
right
mic,
here,
yeah,
just make
please
sure
come up to
everybody
the
can
mic.
hear you.
Yeah, and thank you. Yeah.
That was a great talk, thank you. So my question was around dynamic Apex. So I found it very useful when building packages, but isn't there a performance implication if you overuse it? Because it uses reflection behind the scenes to determine the S object and fields and stuff. So do you think there are any performance implications, or are they negligible?
You know, actually, I don't know the performance implications, although I'm not surprised at all that there are some. So as with anything, make sure that you're weighing, it's not going to be all upside and downside for any solution that you pick, and make sure that you're keeping in mind what's the right solution for your case.
And so I would say the performance hit you're gonna find is in that calculation. So dynamic Apex takes you to basically to the moment of DML, right? Because then when we commit, because we need to know what object we're committing, because the system needs to know, okay, what validation rules should I go check, what sort of security and permissions are around this. Just be careful with that handoff of when you're having to then cast from your dynamic S-object agnostic Apex into your DML. As long as that handoff is as efficient as you can make it, I would say that's where you're going to see the biggest benefit.
Okay, cool,
Yeah.
thank you.
I have a question on formula fields. Actually, I maintain a code base that's about 350,000 lines of Apex code. And one of the things we have been doing is we are moving everything from formula field into Apex because code readability becomes an issue, right?
Yeah.
So trying to understand the business logic by looking at Apex, do we look at we don't know where the business logic is.
How do you see that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's where commenting that code is going to be so important, because there is always a cost when you're having information that's stored in two different places. You're now splitting that across what's in the field definition versus what's in your code.
Yeah.
But I would just say, we also maintain a code base that's been around for a long time. It's got a lot of complexity built into it. And because of that, our release cycle, it takes time. And it's not an easy thing to go through a deployment if we want to make a small change. So for us, the trade-off of being able to make certain changes quickly was absolutely worth the time that it takes to look up what the definition is for that field and update that field.
And actually .org here, I'll do a call out. If you want to go check out the .org GitHub repo that has a ton of things in it, one of the things that is really beautiful about that repo and all the products in it, whether you're looking at the nonprofit starter pack or Volunteers for Salesforce, is that in there now? They have really beautifully formatted code, for real. It's some of the best on the platform as far as what do we do when we comment, and how do we comment, and how are we organizing, and how are we thinking through how things should move in Apex. So I think it's a great resource to go look at how they're handling that.
Thank you for the talk. We are using a custom metadata type, but we find it very hard to upload the records using the metadata type loader. It is always throwing an error, or it is not very user-friendly. You have to install the package from the GitHub repository. Do you internally use any other tool to upload the records?
So for custom metadata?
Yes.
And you're not packaging, you're just you're trying to insert the records?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's a younger API, right? And so often they will come over in change sets. That's one of the smoother ways to bring them over sometimes.
Okay.
Is there a particular reason you were avoiding?
No, the reason is I wanted to test it in the sandbox with the full testing.
Yep.
With the if I need to create some states, US
Yep.
states, so I have to go and manage records.
Yep.
Alabama, Alaska. I have to go through so much page.
Yeah.
So is there any? Do
Yeah.
you internally also use
You
the same?
can move them over in change sets, so I would recommend looking at that. It is a place where that makes it a lot easier, because you often do build those records in a lower environment to test what's happening, and they will move up with a change set.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we have 1 minute left. Is there one final question? Did I just intimidate you?
I
out of
think we
asking?
have a
Okay,
question.
we have
Yes.
a here.
In the near future, do I get an opportunity to update the custom metadata using Apex, like the custom settings?
So you can. There's a new API, the custom metadata API, that does let you update and actually create custom metadata in Apex.
Oh,
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And one more thing, when we use the dynamic Apex, so may I assume it may take more CPU time than the normal way of defining the objects and inserting it?
Yeah, we just had that question a little earlier. So we haven't noticed any sort of giant CPU performance hit with dynamic Apex.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not-
but
not
is that
giant.
handoff?
Yeah, not giant, but a little, at least. Because like we always get an issue like CPU timeout, CPU time limit out. So for those kind of projects,
Yeah.
which does really do the lot of operations, do you recommend to use the dynamic Apex really?
I mean, in our use case, we were calling out a service that was updating one record at a time, so CPU usage was not an issue for that use case. I would just say, again, make sure that you're considering that as a factor when you're deciding how to design your app, because you may have some performance implications that you want to make sure to account for.
Yeah. Thank you.
And we'll be out in the hall if people have more questions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.